Welcome to Beyond the Range podcast, boosting Wyoming's economy. We're traveling to all corners of the Equality State, talking with thought leaders about how Wyomingites navigate new paths towards economic diversification. The Beyond the Range podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Truth. Established in 2021, the Wyoming Truth is a nonpartisan, nonprofit news operation dedicated to helping the community and fighting for the rights of local citizens. And YourGuides.io, a Wyoming-based blockchain startup transforming travel experiences for remote workers and digital nomads. Founded in 2021, YourGuides.io is a crowdsourced travel intelligence platform honoring great adventures and great adventurers. I'm your host, Marco Rubel, a lifelong resident of Wyoming, a father, entrepreneur, and artist. So now, let's go beyond the range. I'm here with Jay Shogren, the Stroock professor at the University of Wyoming. Jay, you have 20 minutes to change the future of Wyoming.
Sure. Well, let's get after it.
Who are you?
Well, my name is Jay Shogren. I got my PhD here from Wyoming. I went away for a decade after that, came back in 95 as a Stroock professor of natural resource conservation and management in the Department of Economics. And my job, according to then Ambassador Stroock, who was still with us, was to get in the middle of all the different fights in Wyoming, get in the middle of all these trade-offs between conservation and development, between trying to dig a new mine versus protect some endangered species. And that's been my job pretty much for the last 40 years, has been to look at all the different challenges we face when we're trying to both have the things we need and the things we want. Sometimes they run smack into each other. And, politics is a big part of it. Policy is a big part of it. And just trying to understand the hidden costs and hidden benefits of all the decisions that we make, because we affect nature, nature affects us. There's feedback loops, and you can't treat an economy and the environment like two different stovepipes that are separate. You got to think of them integrated. And that's really what this Department of Economics has been about for the last 50 years, has been the integration of economics with the natural sciences and other social sciences. We've had a great reputation for 50 years and hopefully for the next 50 years in that process.
And in that process, you continue to lead the nation.
Absolutely. We just had a paper come out in Science yesterday on why we need to use more of the experimental mindset in setting environmental policy at the federal and state level, instead of just guesswork, because it's expensive and it might be really educated guesswork. There are still tools we can use to better understand how much things cost and why, to establish cause and effect, just like a laboratory would do in chemistry. We're asking that environmental managers, environmental policy analysts think about those options as well. So yeah, we're still keeping busy doing what we do.
Right on, man. So let's establish some definitions.
Okay.
I'm not an economist, right? Let's start with, what is an economy?
Sure. Well, let's just back up a little bit.
Okay.
Because when people think of economics, they think of price times quantity, they think of dollars, they think of money in the bank, they think of wealth. And when economists think of an economy, we think of it in a much bigger context. Because if all we're thinking about is wealth, we're thinking about more like finance and accounting, very nuts and bolts, price and quantity. And so economists a lot of times are more like applied philosophers. We're thinking about, how do you structure a system of institutions, and how do you structure a system of incentives so that we get more well-being for everybody. And well-being might well, it's obviously going to include money, but it might include more things than that too, including all the things we love about Wyoming, which is the wide open spaces, the vistas, the animals, the critters we see everywhere, or hopefully we don't run into on the trail, and all the non-market benefits that we enjoy by living here. And so part of what an economy is, and part of what we're trying to do, is make sure those are included in the decisions, both market choices, price times quantity, selling oil, selling gas, selling coal, selling tourism, and the non-market benefits, which are much harder to quantify because we know we value them. It's just hard to put a dollar value on looking out over the Laramie Valley. I mean, how do we know what kind of price we're going to pay? But yet, we do. It's like thinking about a zero risk society. We just don't have that, because if we did, the speed limit would be 2 miles an hour. And, nobody would ever get killed in a car crash, right? So when you think about the trade-offs involved, we have a speed limit because we're making the trade-off between risks and benefits. And we do that all the time in an economy. Wyoming is, the BTU capital of the U.S. At the same time, that means we're producing a lot of the CO2 that is responsible for climate change one way or another. And so we're thinking about, how do we transform our economy into being the BTU carbon capture center of the world as well, by figuring out carbon sequestration and all these things. That's what an economy is. Can you create value through trade? And value is broadly defined. Oftentimes you can create value and you can destroy value at the same time if you've got pollution or you're ripping up a mountain that you really loved. And so the trade-off is, on net, is that thing going to be positive or is it a negative? Because there's both sides of the coin. And that's what we do. We try to understand that kind of stuff. And we try to give advice to policymakers who have to make the hard choices of what kind of trade-off to make. So that was a long-winded way to say an economy is a way to create and destroy value through trade. And on net, we hope it's positive.
How to create and destroy value through trade.
Yep.
And in the end, we hope it's a net positive.
Correct.
Okay.
And so far it has been.
Yeah.
And so far we've been lucky, but we also have to think about the future, and we're thinking about, all the different impacts that climate change can have. We're thinking about the impact that loss of biodiversity can have. We're thinking about the impacts that loss of ecosystem services can have, all the things that are unpriced by the market that we have embedded in our ability to buy things at a relatively low price. Well, pay me now or pay me later, like the guy says. And a lot of times we're not paying now.
Right.
We're going to be paying later, or our children or our grandchildren or future generations. And so that's part of the decision too. Luckily, I'm not the guy making the big decisions. I'm not the governor. I'm not the senators. I'm the guy behind the scenes who, if they have questions, I can help frame the discussion for them, and then they have to put their political thumbs on which scale they want things to do. But, I'm more behind the scenes.
Yeah. So let's try and unpack economic diversification. What I hear is a trade-off.
It's a trade-off. I mean, Wyoming has always struggled through this because we're rich in natural resources. And so there's the idea that, when you are rich in natural resources, that's where you put all your eggs in that basket. And then there's a term called the resource curse, in the sense that now you don't have any manufacturing or you don't have any service industry because you've put all your resources into natural resources. And so when the natural resources prices are going up, everybody's happy. And when they go down, you've got the classic boom and bust. Right. And that's what we've always gone through. And so part of the struggle, and I know different governors had different ideas on how to do this. The last one was in Dow, with the idea of economic diversification through the state. And the question is, how do we do it? We have agriculture, we have cattle, but it's they can grow way more cows down in Florida on less land than we can. Sugar beets is not going to carry the whole state economy. So how much do we invest in agriculture? How much do we invest in tourism? I mean, the one great thing about Wyoming is we only have 500,000 people. So how many tourists do you want to let in? I know when COVID hit and all of a sudden everyone in Colorado and Texas and Florida found the snowy range, it was crazy crowded. And I was like, what happened? Mm-hmm. Right? And at the same time, I'm like, oh, I'm glad they kept, Centennial alive and the Trading Post still has customers, et cetera. And so those kind of trade-offs between diversification, as soon as you start opening it up, you realize what you had, the status quo, is going to change. And you think of Austin, Texas, right? So Austin, let's keep Austin weird has always been their motto. And at one point, Austin was a college town and state capital. And now it's 9-10 million people. I don't even remember how big it is. It's huge because they were so good at attracting people to come to Austin because it had the art scene, it had the music scene, it had the tech scene, it had the university with lots of smart people, it had all the politicians there. And so, yeah, they wanted to grow. And now when you get there, it's like, wow, try to drive 20 miles might take you 2 hours to get where you're trying to go. And so it's kind of like Denver right now, that I-25, right? When I first showed up in 95, they took a referendum down in Colorado, or maybe it was just Denver, build a light rail all the way up to at least Fort Collins, maybe to Cheyenne, or widen the highways. Well, they voted to widen the highways, and they've been widening the highways ever since, right? And so that's a trade-off. You got more highway, but yeah, you got 25 years of construction and expansion, and will they ever be satisfied? I don't know. You can just look at Los Angeles to suggest that it's you can keep widening it forever.
Yeah.
So diversification is important because you don't want all your eggs in one basket. And so the question is how to diversify. And what Wyoming has done is created permanent mineral trust funds, upwards in the order of 30 to 40 billion, in which we have money in coffee cans that generate a flow of income. So when we do have bust times, we have some money set aside that we can fund the schools and we can fund the things that really matter. So instead of thinking about building big manufacturing plants up in Casper, we've set up permanent mineral trust funds, just like Alaska. Alabama has one. New Mexico has one, but not every state does. Like Oklahoma, they did not tax their natural resources, and they just drained all the oil out of it and left the state, and there's nothing left behind in terms of the revenue. Even though the people are still there, the oil's gone and the money's gone, so they have to figure out another way to diversify their economy. Mm-hmm. Challenge with Wyoming is it's going to change, and people in Wyoming kind of like it the way it is.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for a lot of rural states, right? Like I know Maine had the bumper sticker, "Welcome to Maine now. See you later," or whatever it was, "Get the hell out." Right? I think Wyoming had its own equivalent of it, and I'm sure northern Minnesota had its own equivalent, and Montana does too. So diversification, you can envision 50,000 telecommuting fly fishermen, fisherwomen who come out here and just have a low impact, a low footprint on Wyoming. That would be great, but the more people we have, the bigger the footprint. Mm-hmm. The more diversity we have, the bigger the footprint.
Right. So we're back to this trade-off, right, of environment and economy. We're balancing this.
Yeah, it's the key trade-off in how we think about all this. The more we tighten the screws to protect the environment, the less flexibility we have in the economy. The less flexibility we have in the economy when something goes awry in terms of pricing, the more people get stuck. When I grew up in northern Minnesota, just below the Mesabi Range, which was the big place for iron ore during World War II and before. And they ran out of iron ore and they started using taconite, which is they had to ground it up and then use magnets because this taconite, a third of it was iron ore, so they had to pulverize it and pull it out. Well, two things happened. Jobs started leaving, and they started dumping the taconite in Lake Superior. You would think Lake Superior, pristine, one of the world's most beautiful lakes, one of the largest lakes in the world, would never be polluted. But if you're dumping in asbestos-like fibers into Lake Superior, well, you've made a choice on how you're diversifying and how you're trying to keep down the costs. Same thing with Wyoming as we think about putting up even windmills. We're all for renewable energy resources, but some people don't like the sight of windmills going through their ranch. They'll pick up and move. Part of Duluth, I was part of the great Duluth flush of 1980. We had 110,000 people, and in 5 years, there were 85,000 people. And so that's a big shift. And so what economists talk about when we talk about diversification and the interaction with environmental policy and the interaction with other types of policy are these trade-offs to understand, is there a way to increase well-being so on net the winners win more than the losers lose? It's a brutal way to look at the world, but that's how we're thinking about this in terms of there's rarely any policies that are 100% win-win for everybody. The question is, do the winners win more than the losers lose? And if so, is that fair? Is that a fair policy for that to come out? And for the most part, you're now thinking about the trade-off between efficiency, creating value, and equity, how to split the pie. Now, when you get into that line, then you're starting to break down into how people throw their ethics into the equation about what it means to have some kind of sharing rule. Is it effort dependent? What if you have bad luck? What if you make bad choices? What if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time? Should any of those things be compensated for as we think about how to share the wealth when we create the wealth? And, different places have different policies. And economics doesn't have the silver bullet on that. Everybody joins into the discussion then. But think about make the pie bigger. We can talk about that. How to split the pie. Everyone gets a vote.
Yeah, the threads of the social contract probably interweave across disciplines.
Absolutely. And so, but the whole idea of creating value through trade is to make that pie bigger. And if you can create value through trade by diversifying, great. You don't want all your eggs in one basket. If you can create value by protecting nature and setting it up so that the people who are here and the tourists who come enjoy the experience, you've done it as well. You have created value through that exchange. And then it's allocated typically based on pricing systems. Can you afford it or not?
Yeah.
Right?
So let's pretend for a second that one of our viewers, listeners of the Beyond the Range podcast is the governor. And you're advising the governor, the 20,000-foot view, evaluating how we are doing as a state on these trade-offs in this environment of economic diversification. We need you to emanate.
Yeah, I think we're trying. And Cheyenne has the most potential because it is the closest to the big population base down in Denver. Because that's the big part of economic diversification is you need people nearby so that, the costs of getting them goods and services are relatively low. So Cheyenne has the biggest potential. And we see that now developing on I-80 as these, the different distribution centers are coming up, the different computer centers are coming up in terms of holding servers, et cetera. And the difference between Fort Collins and Cheyenne is closing all the time. And that has the biggest potential for doing it. A place like Cody, that has some potential, but it's not so close to the population centers as to the transportation costs are going to be incredibly high.
Right.
Jackson has no land, right? I mean, where are we going to put anything there? And the opportunity costs are so huge because, A, the land is so expensive because there's so little of it in this beautiful place. You would think that Evanston and Kimmerer have a lot of potential because Salt Lake City is close in terms, again, the population center. And I know we're talking about putting in a new nuclear power plant out there, but it could just as easily be some big distribution centers and big manufacturing centers on that part of the state. So the two, the southeast and the southwest corners have a lot of potential. Gillette still has a lot of potential with coal. The question is whether anybody's going to buy our coal in the next 20 years, or is it still going to hang in there as the only sort of consistent or one of the least expensive consistent sources of energy that we have. And I think until we figure out better batteries, that will be true.
Yeah.
Right? We still have enough coal to run the U.S. economy for a good 100, 150 years, 200 years. And so, but can we add more manufacturing up in Gillette? Well, we're on I-90 up there, so the chances are not bad. We also have all the railroad infrastructure as well. So even if coal starts to slow down even more, there are ways to transport things at relatively low costs. That's a big part of the whole diversification, because we, just basing it on tourism is going to be limited. It's going to be limited. We can only put so many people in Yellowstone. We can only put so many people in our national parks and our national forests before people start wanting to come because it's too crowded. Or we start busing them like they do at Yosemite, right? And so that type of operation is important, no doubt. It's a part of the bigger portfolio, but manufacturing is really where a lot of the jobs are and where a lot of the tax base is. And when we don't have a state income tax, we have to rely on taxing something. And right now, taxing our natural resources through the severance tax has been one of our main sources of revenue to build the infrastructure we need to attract more diversification. And as long as we're able to do that, and I think, I don't know the majority of folks who understand the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund in Wyoming, because that money is the tax you don't pay, so you don't see it, right? In Alaska, everyone gets a check in October. Every man, woman, or child. So if you're a family of 10, you get a check of 2,000 times 10 in your family. And so I think everyone in Alaska knows what their permanent mineral trust fund is because they're looking at the check. And it's easier to see the check than it is to see the tax you didn't pay.
Right.
And so part of understanding the diversification is being able to use that money that we have in these trust funds to invest in physical capital, and that could be roads, airports, industrial structures, human capital, which is investing all in schools and education and UW, trying to get enrollment back up, social capital, which is providing the arts and entertainment for all towns, big and small, across the state. And that's partly what the Wyoming Arts Council does is fund projects. I'm on the board of the Wyoming Arts Council these days. And you also have all the sort of natural capital that we have, which we don't want to depreciate in the process of loving it to death.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And so those types of capital, if I was the governor, those are the types of capital you got to focus on. Those are where you got to put your money. Of course, everyone has a different idea of how much should go into each category. But that, to me, is the biggest part, because you want to create a stock. What I tell my students here when they're sitting in class, I say, look, many of you are here on the Hathaway Scholarship, so you've got a nice or reduced free ride here at UW. And you got to think about it this way. Somebody took a stock of rocks, dug it up, sold it, got a stock of money, invested it in your brain. So essentially, yeah, your brain power is full of rocks, one way or another, because we've transformed our natural resources into our human capital. And as long as we can figure out a way for them not to follow the 20-year plan of moving away for 20 years and then making a bunch of money and then coming back and wanting to retire here only, as long as we can keep that brain power that we've created here in Wyoming, that's a big challenge.
Do we have a stopgap for that? Or is it a...
Oh, we're trying. I mean, College of Business here has the entrepreneurial program, entrepreneurial contests, where you float your best idea out like a Shark Tank thing. Mm-hmm. And before, the money was like $5,000, not a big jump start. Now it's more like $50,000 to $100,000. That's a pretty big jump start for someone who has an idea to create jobs here in Wyoming. So if you back me up and you say, well, I thought it wasn't all about price times quantity and wages and all that. Well, yes and no. It's all about jobs. It's all about giving people a reason to be working and giving them some satisfaction in what they're doing. At the same time, it's not all about monetary wealth. It's all about the ability to have the flexibility to do what it is you enjoy. And some people have more opportunity to do that than others. Risk takers sometimes get lucky and sometimes they don't. Mm-hmm. And so our job, at least my job as a professor, is to get those students in the room and take those ideas and get them in their heads so they're not just thinking so narrowly. They can see a broader picture of what the bigger picture is, so that hopefully then they can formulate their own best ideas on living their own best lives. For me, if I can do that, I have done 80% of my job.
Yeah. Yeah, you fostered agency.
Yeah. I guess so.
Well, and we need that. I mean, that is like a Wyoming thing. I mean, it's a human thing, but like in the mythos of Wyoming, like standalone agency, freedom, like you're following that narrative.
And trying to give them the perspective that, things go right and things go wrong, but you better have a plan.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a great plan, but it can be an updated plan. And you can recognize you're going to have some hard choices to make because there are some real trade-offs here that have to be addressed. You just can't wish it away. Mm-hmm. And not everything's win-win. But if the winners win more than the losers lose, maybe you should do it.
If the winners win more than the losers lose?
Maybe you should, but if it goes against your ethos, then maybe you shouldn't.
Yeah. Right? But at least you have a choice.
You got a choice. You got to sort it out. But you got to recognize that that's the challenge, right? You got to recognize that win-win. It happens sometimes, a lot of market exchanges. You're happy I paid that price. I'm happy I got to pay such a low price. We both win. When it's a zero-sum world, which a lot of politics is pushing us towards this notion that the economy is zero sum, you win, I lose. That's not what economics is. Economics is all about positive sum.
Yeah.
Even with losers and winners on net positive. And that positive sum could be money, it could be well-being, it could be you hanging out on a mountain fishing.
So one more question. Why do you do what you do?
Why do I do what I do? I've always been interested in ideas forever, whether it's science or arts, and I've always been sensitive to the feedback loops between people and between nature and between systems that we operate in. I'm just, for whatever reason, sometimes I think, well, I was born in September. I'm a Libra. I'm always constantly balancing these scales. I'm not an astronomer or an astrologer, but there's some things I can't explain. And understanding all these interactions and how people get affected by nature and how we affect nature has just fascinated me. And that goes for both science and arts, because I don't believe you can separate the market from the non-market world. They overlap. And economics uses the market as their organizing principle. Me, I use missing markets as my organizing principle. So when I think about problems, I think about, well, why isn't there a market there to solve that problem?
Yeah.
Should I put a price on it? Should I put a tax on it? Should I create a market for pollution? Should I create a market for endangered species? And then there's a big chunk of the world where markets are not even in their brain. That's just, they're there. And so that intersection between the markets, the missing markets, and the no markets, that is the hardest needle to thread. And I've been doing it for nearly 40 years, over 40 years. And every day is like picking up a guitar and playing a new song. It's just like, wow, I didn't think of that before. And that's why I do what I do, because it's so engrossing. And if I couldn't do it, I don't know what else I would do. I'd probably be busking on the street someplace.
Well, keep doing it. Please keep doing it.
Well, sometimes it's more clear than others, and sometimes it sounds a little confusing, and sometimes people just want solutions. Those things, they don't necessarily take time. They just make sure that you're not, biting the hand that feeds you.
Yeah.
Right? You're just looking out for hidden costs, hidden benefits. You're looking around corners for big feedback loops that's going to smack you right in the face if you didn't see them. And a lot of times you do okay, and sometimes you get smacked, but then you learn, move on, revise.
Win more than you lose, hopefully.
Win more than you lose.
All right, Jay. Well, I appreciate your time, man.
Okay, well.
And we appreciate your insights.
Yeah, I hope that was, it was nonlinear, if not nothing.
I love it.
Okay.
Air high five. It's our tradition. All right. Thanks, man.
Yep.